They said she wasn't human, not anymore. The frame fades in an old, scorched medical ledger, dated October 19, 1008. 123, the entry reads, refused, 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 Margaret C. Untreatable, do not admit. 3 different doctors. 3 different signatures, 1 terrified consensus. The village of Marlowe Hollow, Ohio, was not known to history for much. No railroads passed through. No presidents were born there. And yet, on that autumn morning in 1008, 123, 3 respected physicians, Dr. Elijah Brandt, Dr. Thomas Crane, and Dr. Obadiah Phelps, all independently refused to treat a 17-year-old girl named Margaret Clary. No official diagnosis, no record of examination, only whispers. Locals said she was tainted, that she walked differently after coming back from the old asylum's foundation pit, that birds fell from the sky when she opened her mouth. Her mother begged on her knees in the town square, but each doctor, one after the other, turned and locked their doors. Not out of cruelty, but fear. They weren't afraid of her illness. They were afraid of what treating her would unleash. In the town's oral traditions, those stories passed in low voices behind barn doors. There were always murmurs of something beneath the Clary house. Not ghosts, not demons, something older, something wrong. Margaret was born during a thunderless storm when the wind blew inward and the cows refused to eat for 3 days. Her father, Ezra Clary, dug out the floor beneath their home weeks before her birth. For storage, he said, but neighbors swore they saw him digging at night, muttering in a language no one could place, something like Latin, but with a hiss beneath every syllable. By age 9, Margaret said she could hear voices in the floorboards. They hummed to me, she'd tell her mother, like bees trapped under water. But the humming stopped the day she fell through the rotted planks and vanished for 6 hours. When they found her, curled fetal and soaked in red clay, she wasn't the same. She stared too long. Her speech became slow, fragmented, like her thoughts were coming from somewhere else. Ezra Clary refused to say what she'd been doing down there. Then, one night, he burned every Bible in the house and began building another floor beneath the one she fell through to contain her or protect us. On October 18, 1008, 123, just 1 day before the refusals were written into the ledger, the 3 doctors met in secret. Not in a clinic, not at church, but in the cellar of the old Sable Masonic Lodge, 3 miles outside Marlowe Hollow, long condemned, long whispered about. A building built before the Revolution by men no one remembers. They brought with them Margaret's blood, collected from her discarded bedsheets. Dr. Crane insisted on burning it. Dr. Brandt brought holy water, unlabeled. Dr. Phelps recited Psalm 91 backwards. Something had terrified them. Not just the girl, but what was inside her. Brandt had examined her once, months before the refusals. He would later tell his wife in a fit of sleepless madness, her pulse stopped 3 times while I was touching her, and yet she kept whispering, in my voice. Crane performed an autopsy on a neighbor's dog that had died outside the Clary home. The tongue had turned black, the heart was gone. Phelps, the eldest, recognized a sigil carved into Margaret's fingernail. A symbol etched in the walls of the asylum ruins buried under the town. A mark none of them were supposed to see. The doctors made a vow, if she ever came to them again, they would refuse. Even if it killed her. The Marlowe Hollow Asylum for the Mentally Frail was never officially listed in the state's medical registries. No blueprints, no state funding, no surviving documentation, and yet everyone in Marlowe Hollow knew it had existed. They called it the Lantern House, not because of any light within, but because lanterns never stayed lit near it. It was said to have been built in 1798, during Ohio's frontier days, on land bought from the Wyandot people. Land they refused to step on after the first frost each year. They called it ground that remembers, though no white settler bothered to ask what that meant. By 1812, the asylum was sealed, not closed, sealed. Stone and iron packed into every window, doors soldered shut. Even the weather vane was removed, as if any symbol of movement might bring something back. Local children dared each other to touch the threshold. Most refused. Those who did spoke of hearing singing, but always behind them, just out of reach. Some went home sick. Others spoke in languages they'd never learned. The asylum burned in 1817. No survivors. No remains, but when Margaret fell through the floorboards of the Clary house 6 years later, she was found covered in soot, her fingernails packed with old ash, and in her hand a rusted lantern wick. After the fall, Margaret would no longer show her face in daylight. Her mother sewed a veil from black mourning lace, meant for a funeral that had never been held. Margaret insisted on wearing it at all times, even indoors. "Even in sleep, the faces stare back at me," she said. "I can't bear them seeing I've come back." But she never explained who they were. She refused food unless it was wrapped in cloth, refused to speak above a whisper. She'd sit for hours at the fireplace, slowly turning pages of books that had no words, books she claimed she brought up from beneath. By spring of 1823, children in town began calling her the bride below. It was cruel, but not inaccurate. She moved like a widow who had never been married, solemn with a strange calm, as if she belonged to something deeper than grief. Animals wouldn't go near her, cats shrieked. Dogs barked themselves hoarse and collapsed. Her father tried to bring in a priest. The man came once, saw her sitting silently behind her veil, and left without saying a word. He resigned the next day. They say Margaret's eyes were still human. But what stared out from behind that veil was not. In the spring thaw of 1823, a carpenter named Josiah Beardsley was hired to reinforce the rotting bell tower at St. Lament's Parish, the only church in Marlowe Hollow. During his digging, he struck something beneath the bell post, something that made a sound no wood or stone should make. He uncovered a jawbone, fused into the clay, human but twisted, not by decay, by design. The teeth were filed into points. The hinge was broken clean, as if it had once opened too wide. Josiah showed the artifact to Father Wilcox, who blanched and told him to bury it again, deeper this time. "Do not speak of it, ever," he said. "That's not from this flock." But it was too late. That night the bell began to ring without wind or rope, 3 times precisely at 3:33 a.m., the hour the locals whispered as the hour without name. It woke the entire town. Margaret rose from her bed and stood at her window the entire night. When her mother found her the next morning, her veil was gone. Her mouth was covered in blood. "It's not mine," she said. "It's remembering." The jawbone was gone. And so was Josiah. 2 weeks after Josiah vanished, his wife, Eleanor Beardsley, known to townsfolk as the widow of Hollow Hill, walked barefoot into St. Lament's with a journal clutched to her chest. Her nightgown was torn, streaked in mud and candle wax. Her eyes were swollen shut. She dropped the book at the altar and said only one word before collapsing: "Margaret." The journal, later hidden in the rectory's attic, was not written in one hand. It changed slightly with each entry: ink pressure, loops, margins. Some entries were shaky and urgent, others slow, elegant, almost reverent, like the voices of several people, or one person being used by several minds. Eleanor wrote of Margaret visiting her at night, not knocking, not entering, just standing at the edge of the woods, whispering words only Eleanor could hear. She speaks in the same voice Josiah did when he dreamed after the digging, but now there's more than one voice in her. One cries, one laughs, and one only says, "Return." She began waking with scratches beneath her tongue. Soil under her fingernails. She claimed Margaret had brought something back, but it had no name. The last page was written in red. The doctors think they refused her, but they only delayed her. In late autumn of 1823, Mr. Alfred Greast, the aging schoolmaster of Marlowe Hollow, closed the village schoolhouse indefinitely. He cited sanitary concerns in his official letter, but that was a lie. What he truly found was hidden in the crawlspace beneath the classroom floor. It began with a foul, iron-like stench that no amount of lie could mask. Students complained of hearing a slurping noise from the floorboards during lessons. One boy, Jeremiah Locke, stood in the middle of class and began drawing circles in blood with his finger, though he had no wounds. Greast, shaken, searched the crawlspace that evening. There, half buried in the dirt, were pages, torn from prayer books, anatomy manuals, and what appeared to be letters written by Margaret Clary before her fall. The ink was a deep, congealed brown. On every page, the same symbol, the same sigil carved into her nail, a spiral of teeth, inked over and over again. He found something worse beneath the final plank, a child's lower jaw, fused to the wood, as if the floor had grown around it. Greased nailed the crawlspace shut. The next morning he was found at his desk with his eyes removed and his mouth sewn shut. Pinned to his coat, a drawing of Margaret's veil. Near the edge of Marlowe Hollow, where the trees grow too close together and the soil is always damp, sits old Wisher's well, a crumbling stone relic from before the town was mapped. Children were told to stay away, not because it was unsafe, but because sometimes it spoke back. In late October 1823, the Clary family's neighbor, Agnes Furlow, claimed to hear Margaret's voice echoing from the well one night. But Margaret was inside her home, asleep, face hidden, body locked in shivering paralysis. Agnes said the voice didn't ask for help. It asked for exchange, one tongue for one name, one tooth for one truth. The next morning, villagers found a sheep curled at the base of the well, its head completely missing, but no blood on the ground, only a spiral of small white stones surrounding it. Margaret didn't speak for 2 days. Then suddenly, at supper, she lifted her veil and said, "There's a child in the water. She has my name, but not my soul." Her mother dropped her fork. Her father fled the room. The well was sealed the next day with iron and salt, but the whisper never stopped. And neither did Margaret's slow, impossible knowledge of things no one taught her. On October 31st, 1823, All Hallows' Eve, Father Wilcox stood before the trembling congregation of St. Laments with a parchment in his hands. He said it was a sermon passed down from the first fathers, not clerics, not bishops, but something older. He had not planned to read it. In fact, he claimed to have burned it years ago, but it had returned. Ashes still clung to the corners, yet the writing was untouched, not in ink but scratched, as if written by fingernails into flesh. Thin vellum, he began to read. The words were harsh, staccato, filled with unfamiliar syllables. Latin, yes, but distorted, reversed, broken. As he spoke, the oil lamps dimmed, and those near the front claimed Margaret, veiled, seated in the last pew, began to rock back and forth, humming low. Then her veil lifted on its own. Her eyes were black, not pupil, less, not bloodshot, black like hollow glass, as if something had scooped out what once lived behind them. Father Wilcox dropped the sermon. It erupted in flames on the pulpit, without kindling, without spark. He never returned to church again. He left a note on his door. "She isn't sick. She's remembering, and so am I." Before Brant, before Crane, before Phelps, there was one other, Dr. Josiah Altham, a British physician who had come to Marlowe Hollow in 1815, 8 years before the incident, with a strange obsession, the trauma of memory in soil-burdened places. He lived alone, kept no cross in his home, and was rumored to speak in tongues while he slept. He vanished in 1818, shortly after visiting the site where the asylum once stood. Locals assumed he drowned in the river or ran mad into the forest, but he returned quietly on November 3rd, 1823, 3 days after Father Wilcox's sermon fire. His hair had gone white. His left hand had been replaced with something mechanical, crafted from surgical tools and rusted metal, but it was his eyes that unsettled most, wide, alert, and unblinking, like he hadn't closed them in years. He said nothing to the town, went straight to the Clary home. There Margaret waited at the hearth, not rocking, not weeping, just smiling. Dr. Altham knelt before her without a word, unwrapped a waxed parcel, and removed something grotesque, a tongue, perfectly preserved in salt and ash. Not human, far too long. He offered it to her, and she nodded, like she'd been expecting it. By the second week of November 1823, No one in Marlowe Hollow walked past the Clary home after dark. It wasn't the silence. It was what broke it. Each night, at precisely 2:17 a.m., a scraping sound echoed from the Clary attic, like nails dragging along the underside of the roof. The town midwife, Helen Gauss, who lived across the road, claimed to see something move behind the attic's circular window. Not a face, not a shadow, a shape, bulging, twitching, coiling. She described it as a body with too many joints, too many elbows, or none at all. One night, Helen swore it spoke her name, not aloud, not whispered. She felt it in her lungs, as if the air itself said it. The next morning, all the attic windows in town were found painted black, an old Dutch protection custom no one had used in over 50 years. Even houses with no memory of the Clarys now feared what was looking out. When questioned, Margaret responded calmly, "It's not in the attic. The attic is just its mouth." That night, something large was heard moving on the inside of the roof. And the next morning, 2 pigeons were found dead. Their beaks had been stitched shut. On November 10th, 1823, the bell at St. Lament's tolled 3 times, but no one pulled the rope. The church doors were locked. The priest long gone, the bell tower sealed after the Jawbone incident, and yet the bell rang, 3 sharp notes, then silence so deep it made the living feel drowned in it. Old women wept in their sleep. Men woke with blood from their ears. Children refused to speak for 3 days. That same evening, a funeral procession took place with no casket. 7 men, all in black, marched from the Clary home to the church steps, carrying nothing but a length of cloth, deep red, soaked through and knotted in places like a human spine. No words were spoken. No names were given. At the church door they stopped. Margaret followed them barefoot, veil lifted for the first time in public. Her mouth was moving, but no sound came out, only flies. Inside the church, candles lit themselves. The red cloth was laid on the altar like flesh. That night, a storm tore through Marlowe Hollow. No thunder, no lightning, just wind screaming through closed windows, carrying one phrase over and over. Now she remembers, Dr. Elijah Brandt had not practiced medicine since the night he refused to treat Margaret. He shuttered his practice, sold most of his instruments, and boarded up the nursery of his home, even though he and his wife had no children. But what he sealed within that room was never meant to be found. On November 14th, 4 days after the silent funeral, the housekeeper, an aging Irish widow named Moira Kells, reported a strange humming coming from behind the nursery wall. A sound like a lullaby, but wrong. Words twisted and reversed, the tune crumbling mid-verse. She forced the door open. The walls were covered in crude chalk markings, rings, eyes, veils, mouths. But it was what lay behind the east wall panel that made her drop to her knees. It wasn't a doll, not exactly. It was made of twine, stitched cloth, and what she later swore were human teeth, bound in Margaret's veil, stuffed with pages from medical books. Its chest cavity was hollow, but packed with dried rose petals and one severed fingertip, still wearing Margaret Clary's ring. Pinned to its forehead was a note in Brandt's handwriting. "I took it from her. I should have let it stay. She wasn't the patient. She was the tomb. That night, Doctor." Brandt disappeared. Only his shoes were found, facing the nursery wall. By mid-November 1823, the Clary house had changed. Neighbors swore they could hear it exhale. A deep draw, not wheeze that came from no door, no window, no pipe. Just the walls, as if the timber itself had lungs. One farmer passing by late at night claimed he saw the entire house shift, like a chest rising to inhale. Another said the shutters no longer clattered in the wind. They twitched like eyelids fighting sleep. Inside, Margaret refused to leave the parlor. She no longer ate. Her mother left food untouched by the hearth, and by morning it was always gone, but never chewed, just missing. The town's blacksmith, drawn by the strange noises, crept up to the window one night and saw Margaret standing still at the fireplace. Her veil was gone. Her mouth moved slowly, silently. The flames behind her twisted sideways, flickering to the rhythm of her breath. But it wasn't her breath. The room pulsed, the wallpaper quivered, and then the house exhaled, hard, sending ash, soot, and a voice through the windowpane. You built over its mouth, and now she speaks for what's buried. The blacksmith fled, only to collapse in the snow. His final words, "There was no Margaret. There never was." On the frozen night of November 18th, 1823, the people of Marlowe Hollow gathered with torches, oil, and salt, silent, pale, moving like men who had already sinned. They didn't come to ask questions, they came for Margaret. The Clary house stood still as they approached, moonlight sliding over its warped shingles like sweat on skin. No birds, no dogs, no wind, only Margaret's voice from the upstairs window. "If you burn me, you burn what remembers you." The torches were lit anyway. They circled the house, threw oil at the foundation, chanted Psalm 23 through cracked, terrified lips. The first flame struck the porch and died before it touched wood. The second flared upward, then turned, curling back toward the man who threw it. He burned from the inside out. His screams didn't echo. They were absorbed. The house began to breathe again, labored, rhythmic, hungry. The shutters burst open, and Margaret appeared in the doorway. But it wasn't just her. The veil lifted, and behind her eyes was a second face, upside down, expressionless, blinking sideways. A dozen men dropped to their knees, coughing up feathers. Someone whispered, "We waited too long. She's no longer alone." They ran. But the house never stopped burning, and nothing turned to ash. 1 week after the failed burning, Dr. Obadiah Phelps, the third of the refusing physicians, returned to the churchyard with a spade and a lantern, alone. He had a theory, one he never dared speak aloud. He no longer believed Margaret had returned from the asylum. He believed she had never left it. There had been a girl buried in plot 39A, Margaret Clary, recorded as having died at age 7 of scarlet fever. But Phelps remembered the funeral too well, the closed casket, the weight that didn't feel right, the mother who wouldn't cry. He dug through frozen earth until his knuckles bled, but what he unearthed wasn't a child. It was a bundle of bones, animal, not human, bound in strips of linen, each cloth marked with the same spiral, tooth sigil etched into Margaret's nail. He found no skull, but there was something else inside the grave, a small note, aged but dry, tucked inside the ribcage. The first Margaret was swallowed, the second Margaret was taught to forget, the third will return everything. Phelps never made it home. They found his lantern on the altar the next morning. Its glass was warped from the inside, as if something within had screamed in heat, and never stopped. After the frost of late November, something strange began to happen to the children of Marlowe Hollow. They stopped sleeping, not from fear, but from invitation. Parents reported waking to find their sons and daughters standing at the foot of their beds, staring at the windows, not blinking, not shivering, silent, except for the occasional whisper of a song none could identify. The children all claimed the same thing: "She sings to us through the walls." At first, the song was harmless, a lullaby without melody. Then it deepened, slowed, became rhythmic, ritualistic, sacred, and one by one the children began to draw, spiral mouths, veiled faces, open rib cages, and eyes without pupils. The schoolhouse was found empty one morning, desks overturned, a single phrase scratched into every surface in charcoal: "We were hers before we were born." By sundown, 13 children were found gathered at the Clary house, barefoot in the snow, humming in perfect unison. Their eyes had changed. The pupils had retreated, leaving a silvery ring like frost on glass. Margaret opened the door without touching it. She didn't speak. She didn't smile. She just stepped aside. And they walked in, one by one. By the time winter bled fully into Marlowe Hollow, the Clary house had gone silent. No breath, no hum, no flickering candlelight behind the curtains, only stillness and the scent of wet copper that never faded. Sheriff Loring, driven by guilt and dread, broke down the door with 2 deputies and entered what remained of the house. Inside, every surface had been stripped, wallpaper torn, paint scraped off, even floorboards lifted. The walls were carved with words, thousands of them, not with ink, not with charcoal, with bone, not just symbols but names. Every man, woman, and child who had ever denied Margaret, or her mother, or the asylum that had once stood beneath them. Birth dates, death dates, lies they had told, secrets they had buried. Some names hadn't happened yet. On the second floor, in what had once been Margaret's bedroom, the ceiling read, "She is not possessed. She is possessing." We are all rooms in her house now. In the far corner, under a nailed-shut window, they found her veil, folded, perfectly clean. Inside it, a set of teeth, each one belonging to a different child, but no bodies, only one final word, gouged deep above the fireplace, opened. The town of Marlowe Hollow no longer exists. Officially, it was abandoned in 1824 after a fire of unknown origin consumed the church, the schoolhouse, and nearly every home. Survivors relocated, records were lost, maps reprinted, but the land still breathes. If you walk deep enough into the southern Ohio woods, past the frost, thick trees, and down the old road that no longer appears on any GPS, you'll find it, a clearing where no birds sing, where the soil is dark, soft, and warm even in winter. The Clary house is gone, yes, but the foundation remains, and beneath that, buried in red clay and black roots, lies what Margaret called the first mouth. A pit, not wide, not deep, but alive, lined with scorched brick. The stone ring of the old asylum well nearby. If you kneel down, the air tastes metallic. If you wait long enough, you might hear the lullaby, the one with no melody, and if you whisper your name into the hole, something might answer. They say Margaret was never treated because she wasn't meant to be healed. She was meant to return, not a girl, not a patient, but a key, and the lock is still turning beneath Ohio. Even now,